In the summer of 1878, typhoid fever tragically claimed the lives of 47 residents in Harper County, Kansas. Amidst the carnage, the brothers, the Blackwoods, exhibited an immunity that medical science couldn't explain. However, their survival was purchased at a price so unsettling that 3 separate doctors refused to record their findings, leading the Kansas State Medical Board to quietly seal all records associated with the incident. What began as an apparent miracle of divine protection evolved into something truly malign. The sinister transformation. The change was so deeply disturbing that the local Methodist Church systematically burned every record referencing the Blackwood family. The brothers began to exhibit symptoms previously unknown to any medical textbook, characteristics that became progressively more inhuman with each passing day. By the onset of winter, neighbors were whispering that the brothers no longer cast proper shadows. Their voices had acquired unsettling harmonic qualities capable of making listeners' ears bleed, and their eyes reflected light just like those of nocturnal predators. The final medical report, still classified today, allegedly contained a chilling phrase: subjects have transcended human biological classification before all documentation was permanently sealed. Uncovering the silence. Tonight, after almost 150 years of silence, we are set to expose why modern science still refuses to acknowledge the events on that isolated farm and why the truth about Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood may be more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. But before we dive deeper into the story of the Blackwood brothers, a crucial request: this channel is not for everyone, it's reserved only for the bravest souls who dare to seek the truths others are afraid to speak. If you consider yourself one of these genuine mystery seekers, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're tuning in from. Are you prepared to face what really happened when faith and science violently converged on the Kansas prairie? Now, let's journey back to 1878, a time and place where faith and fear were inseparable companions. Cedar Ridge, a setting of faith and isolation. The small farming community of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, was little more than a junction point between wheat fields and cattle ranches in the late 1870s. With only about 300 residents scattered across the windswept prairie, it was a place where life was transparent, a man's integrity was paramount, and Sunday worship at the Methodist Church was both a spiritual imperative and the primary social event. The brutal, burying blizzards of winter and the scorching, crop-killing summers had created a population of stoic, God-fearing people who accepted hardship as a test from the divine and viewed prosperity as a heavenly gift. The landscape itself seemed to reinforce this worldview. Miles of golden wheat stretched to every horizon, interrupted only by the occasional windmill, farmhouse, or grove of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. The sky was the ultimate presence, vast, limitless, and perpetually shifting. During a storm, lightning would endlessly dance across the prairie, illuminating the isolation of each homestead in brilliant, brief flashes. In the winter, the wind howled across the flatlands with a sound almost human, carrying a deadly cold that could freeze a man to death in minutes if he strayed between his house and barn. The Blackwood arrival and character. The Blackwood brothers arrived in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1872. They purchased 640 acres of prime prairie land using inheritance money from their father's farm in Clinton County, Ohio. They had sold all their previous holdings, packed their possessions into 2 covered wagons, and traveled west with a singular focus, convinced they were following a divine calling. Ezra Blackwood, the eldest at 36 upon their arrival, possessed the innate leadership of a man used to responsibility. 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a seasoned farmer, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that earned respect without demanding it. His hands, scarred from constant labor, could just as easily gentle a frightened horse as guide a plow. But it was his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, that people remembered most. They seemed to gaze straight through a person to something deeper. Those who spoke with Ezra often felt he had instantly judged their soul and found them wanting. Caleb, 2 years Ezra's junior, served as the family's practical strategist and business manager. While Ezra led with moral authority, Caleb governed with meticulous planning and mathematical precision. He could forecast grain yields, livestock prices, and weather patterns with a startling accuracy that impressed even the county's most veteran farmers. His ledgers, kept in exquisite handwriting, tracked every penny, every bushel, and every animal. Yet, beneath his pragmatic exterior lay the same intense faith that motivated his brothers. Caleb saw the hand of God in everything, the perfect symmetry of a wheat field, the exact timing of the rain, the mathematical harmony governing the natural world. Josiah, the third brother at 31, was the most formally educated. He had spent 2 years at Ohio Wesleyan University before his father's death called him back to the family farm. There, he had pursued not only theology but also medicine, philosophy, and the natural sciences. His personal library, transported to Kansas in a custom-built crate, boasted over 200 volumes ranging from biblical commentary to human anatomy. Josiah's room in the farmhouse resembled a scholar's study more than a farmer's quarters, with stacks of books and meticulously noted papers filling every available space. Abel, the youngest at 25, burned with a religious fervor that sometimes concerned even his devoted siblings. While the older brothers expressed their devotion through scholarly depth or practical application, Abel's faith was pure emotion and absolute surrender. He spent hours daily in prayer, often weeping from the intensity of his connection with the divine. He routinely fasted, sometimes for days, claiming to subsist entirely on prayer and scripture. Back in Ohio, fellow church members called him touched by the Spirit, but others had worried that his devotion was bordering on a dangerous obsession. The Blackwood Chapel and routine. Unlike their neighbors, who attended the modest, white-painted Methodist church in town, whose bell tower could be heard for miles, the Blackwood brothers built their own chapel on a hill overlooking their property. This construction project consumed the better part of their first year in Kansas. They quarried limestone from a local creek bed, cut oak timber from their land, and crafted every piece of the structure with their own hands. The chapel was a reflection of their austere yet profound faith. Measuring 30 by 20 feet, with perfectly fitted limestone walls and a roof of hand-split oak shingles, it was a testament to labor and devotion. Inside, they had carved the pews from local walnut wood, each one smooth and fitted with joinery that bespoke hours of patient craft. The altar, also hand-carved, was engraved with Hebrew inscriptions Josiah had copied from his biblical texts. Tall windows on the east and west filled the space with golden light during their dawn and dusk prayers. The brothers held their own services every Sunday morning and evening, adhering to what they termed primitive Methodist principles, a stricter interpretation of Wesley's teachings that prioritized personal revelation, direct communion with God, and the concept of the priesthood of all believers. Their worship included extended periods of silent prayer, intensive Bible study, and sharing what they called testimony of the Spirit, where each brother would recount any divine insights he had received during the week. Their daily life was a synchronized commitment to both faith and labor. They rose at 4 a.m. for an hour of silent prayer in the chapel, watching the sun rise over the eastern prairie while communing with God individually. After a simple breakfast, they spent the mornings working the fields. The afternoons were dedicated to animal care, equipment maintenance, and other necessary farm tasks. However, the evening was always reserved for spiritual pursuits, Bible study, theological discussion, and group prayer that frequently lasted well past midnight. The brothers lived as lifelong bachelors, totally dedicated to their land and their faith. Prosperity and puzzlement. By the summer of 1878, the Blackwood farm was a shining example of both agricultural success and spiritual dedication. Their wheat fields were golden and vast, their cattle healthy, their silo overflowing, and their chapel stood as a powerful symbol of their unwavering conviction. They had achieved the independence, prosperity, and freedom to worship they had sought 6 years earlier. The neighbors in Cedar Ridge respected the Blackwood brothers for their honesty, their willingness to help in a crisis, and their reputation for hard work. However, many found their intensity disturbing and their isolation from the community puzzling. They were known for refusing casual conversation and for their habit of scrutinizing everyone they met with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to one's soul. When the brothers came to town for supplies, a bi-weekly event executed with military precision, they conducted their business quietly and efficiently, speaking only when absolutely necessary and avoiding the social pleasantries other farmers enjoyed. Children often stared at the four identical, perfectly trimmed, jet-black beards that gave the brothers an almost biblical look. The onset of the epidemic. The first case of typhoid fever appeared in Cedar Ridge on July 15, 1878. It struck with the sudden, brutal violence typical of the most virulent strains. Mrs. Sarah Hartman, who ran the general store, had been cheerful that morning, but by afternoon she was engulfed by fever, her skin marked by the characteristic rose-colored spots. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's sole physician, rushed to the store to find Sarah delirious, her temperature barely registering on his thermometer. Her husband, Benjamin, a usually calm man, paced frantically, begging the doctor to save his wife. "Doctor, she was fine this morning," Benjamin desperately repeated. How does a person go from healthy to this in a few hours? Dr. Morrison had seen typhoid during his training in Philadelphia, but never like this. The disease usually took days or weeks to progress. Sarah Hartman's case had compressed the entire devastating course into a single day. Her fever was the highest he had ever recorded, her delirium complete and violent, and the spots covered her body in an almost deliberately symmetrical pattern. Despite his best efforts, cold compresses, laudanum for pain, Sarah Hartman died just after midnight on July 16. Even in death, her case troubled the doctor. Her body became rigid too quickly, her skin developed a waxy, preservative pallor, and her eyes, though closed by the doctor, repeatedly opened again. The disease spreads. Within 24 hours of Sarah's death, 3 more cases emerged, all seemingly connected only by their use of water from the town's main well. Dr. Morrison inspected the well and found contamination from runoff that had breached the stone lining. The second victim was Heinrich Zimmermann, an old German immigrant farmer. His case mirrored Sarah's: perfect health in the morning, a raging fever by afternoon, and death before dawn. But Heinrich's final hours were marked by something unprecedented. He spoke in languages no one recognized, using words that sounded both ancient and menacing. The third and fourth victims were the Patterson twins, Emma and Ellen, both 16. Their deaths were especially heartbreaking, occurring simultaneously. Their father, James Patterson, later told Dr. Morrison that in their final delirium, the girls spoke in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like prayers in a language similar to Latin but containing sounds that human throats should not have been able to produce. By August 1, 14 people had died from this strange typhoid strain. Dr. Morrison's records documented a progression that defied all principles of medical science. Victims died within 24 hours of symptoms, their fevers reached temperatures that should have killed them instantly, and their final hours were marked by a delirium that felt more like possession than a medical crisis. Terror and divine calling. Terror gripped Cedar Ridge. Families barricaded themselves indoors. The general store was a hub of whispered fear and furtive glances. The Methodist Church, usually a source of comfort, stood nearly empty, as people feared contagion from any gathering. Dr. Morrison sealed the contaminated well and advised boiling water, but the disease continued to spread according to a pattern that seemed to have nothing to do with simple contamination. The victims appeared to be chosen by some unknowable logic. It was against this backdrop of confusion and dread that the Blackwood brothers made their fateful choice to intervene. They had remained isolated on their farm, but on August 10, Josiah announced what he believed to be a divine revelation calling them to action. "I have prayed for guidance," Josiah declared to his brothers at their evening meal. "And the Lord has shown me this pestilence is a test, not just of the community's faith, but of our own worthiness to serve as his instruments. We have been spared from the disease not for our safety, but so we can demonstrate the power of true faith in the face of the ultimate trial." The sacrifice. The decision was implemented with the brothers' trademark methodical precision. On August 11, Josiah traveled to town, ostensibly to volunteer their help to Dr. Morrison. His true, undisclosed purpose was to place himself in direct contact with the disease, to invite it to test his faith and prove his worthiness as God's instrument. Josiah's first stop was the home of Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith, whose 8-year-old son, Timothy, was suffering from a raging fever and convulsions. Josiah found the family desperately praying by the boy's bedside. What followed would be recounted differently by the witnesses, but all agreed on its profound and disturbing nature. Josiah knelt beside Timothy's bed and placed his hands on the boy's feverish forehead. Instead of a conventional prayer for recovery, Josiah spoke words that would haunt all present. "Lord God," Josiah prayed, his voice resonating unusually across the room, "if this child must suffer for reasons only known to your divine wisdom, then let that suffering pass through me and my brothers. Let us bear what he cannot, experience what he should not, and become whatever we must become to serve your mysterious purposes." Take this innocent life and spare it through our willing sacrifice. The transfer. As Josiah spoke, his hands felt warm against Timothy's forehead. The boy's convulsions began to subside, his fever broke, and for the first time in hours, Timothy Fletcher opened his eyes, asking for water and complaining of hunger. The recovery was so sudden and dramatic that Thomas Fletcher immediately fell to his knees, praising God for the miracle. However, those who watched Josiah noticed a more subtle, yet disturbing, exchange. As the boy's fever disappeared, Josiah's own skin flushed, suggesting his body temperature was rising. His eyes, normally pale blue, began to show flecks of gold that shifted and moved like liquid metal. When Josiah finally stood, he moved with the strained caution of a man struggling to control his own body. Dr. Morrison, summoned to witness the supposed miracle, examined both the boy and Josiah with increasing alarm. Timothy showed no trace of typhoid, yet Josiah exhibited early symptoms that were progressing faster than medically possible. Over the next 2 days, Josiah visited every afflicted household, repeating the ritual, placing his hands on the sick and praying for their suffering to be transferred to him and his brothers. The results were remarkably effective and terrifyingly consistent. Victims experienced sudden, complete recoveries, but with each healing, Josiah's condition deteriorated more rapidly. Purification or sickness? By August 13, when he returned to the Blackwood farm, Josiah was consumed by a high fever and symptoms never before described in medicine. Yet, he continued to insist that everything was unfolding according to a divine plan. Even as his fever spiked to life-threatening temperatures, he spoke clearly about the sacred nature of his change. "This is not sickness," he told his worried brothers, "this is purification. The Lord is burning away everything in me that is merely human, so that what remains will be worthy of the eternal work He has planned for us." Within hours, all 4 Blackwood brothers began to display the same symptoms that had overwhelmed Josiah. But their collective transformation would prove to be far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The medical examination. Dr. Morrison's first examination of the Blackwood brothers on August 18, 1878, became the single most significant and disturbing case of his medical career. The oppressive August heat shimmered, turning the distant farmhouse into a mirage as he approached. Yet, Morrison noted strangely out-of-place details. The brothers' wheat fields, unlike every other farm in the drought, stood tall and green as if regularly watered. The cattle appeared healthy and well-fed despite regional grazing difficulties. When Ezra opened the farmhouse door, his appearance immediately struck the doctor as profoundly wrong. Ezra's skin had become translucent, revealing a network of blood vessels beneath, but the blood was not the normal red, it possessed a golden luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra said, his voice amplified and enriched with harmonic overtones that made every word resonate in the listener's chest. "We have been expecting you. Our transformation is almost complete, and we require your witness to ensure that others understand what has taken place here." Morrison found the 4 brothers arranged in the main room, their bodies positioned with a mathematical precision suggesting careful planning. They were conscious, breathing, and their eyes tracked his movements, yet they were transformed in ways that fundamentally challenged his understanding of human physiology. "Their vital signs are impossible," Morrison recorded in his private journal at night. Ezra's temperature was 107 degrees, yet he was upright and speaking clearly. Caleb's pulse was barely detectable, yet he moved normally. Josiah's breathing had slowed to one inhale and exhale every few minutes, with no sign of oxygen deprivation. Abel's skin temperature was actually lower than normal, despite his apparent fever symptoms. A living equation. Caleb, seated to Ezra's right, exhibited equally dramatic but distinct changes. The characteristic typhoid rose-colored spots covered his entire body, but instead of a random scattering, they formed complex geometric designs resembling mathematical equations written in flesh and blood. As Morrison watched in horrified fascination, the pattern slowly shifted, as if Caleb's skin were a living blackboard. "The calculations are becoming clear," Caleb declared, his voice joining Ezra's in perfect simultaneous harmony. The relationship between matter and spirit, between time and eternity, between human limits and divine potential. We are becoming the proof of theorems that human mathematics has only begun to glimpse. Josiah's transformation reflected his scholarly, theological nature. While his basic structure was human, his skin had taken on the appearance of ancient parchment covered with writing in scripts Morrison recognized as Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, mixed with other symbols that seemed to perpetually shift. When Josiah spoke, his voice was no longer entirely human. The sound seemed to originate from multiple points around the room simultaneously, making the doctor feel as if he were being addressed by an invisible choir. "Doctor, we have discovered truths that your medical science cannot accommodate," Josiah asserted. "We are documenting these revelations so that future generations might comprehend the process of divine transformation." Abel, the youngest, had undergone the most visually striking change. His entire body emitted a soft phosphorescent glow, a cool blue-white radiance that seemed to come from within his very bones. His eyes had become completely luminous, lacking pupils or irises, appearing instead as twin stars set into a human face. "We no longer require food as sustenance," Abel's words reached Morrison from both inside the room and what seemed like a great distance. "We draw our energy directly from sources that human science has not yet discovered. We are becoming something new, something that exists between the mortal and eternal realms." Resistance and growing unease. Morrison's attempts to document his findings were met with resistance from the brothers. They claimed their condition was a divine gift, a sign they had been chosen for a special purpose, asserting they were being refined by holy fire into worthy vessels. However, Dr. Morrison's training suggested otherwise. Their symptoms matched no known disease, and their collective transformation hinted at either mass hysteria or something far more sinister. He began to suspect an unknown toxin, perhaps from their water or contaminated grain. The community's reaction was mixed and increasingly strained. Some, led by Reverend Marcus Thorne of the Methodist Church, saw their survival as a miracle and started making pilgrimages to the farm, hoping for a first-hand glimpse of divine intervention. Others, particularly those who had lost family members, found the transformation unnatural and disturbing. "It ain't right," muttered Jacob Steinbrook, who had buried his wife and 2 children. "Why should they be spared when good Christian folk are dying? That ain't no blessing I can see. There's something wrong with those boys." The brothers' behavior only intensified the local unease. They continued working their fields with an eerie, silent coordination. Neighbors reported seeing them standing motionless for hours, their faces turned skyward as if listening to an inaudible voice. Their chapel services became particularly unsettling. Their evening prayers, once private, could now be heard across the prairie, a hauntingly beautiful but profoundly wrong sound of 4 voices harmonizing in ways no human vocal cords should be capable of producing. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a neighbor, told Dr. Morrison she had approached the chapel one evening to investigate the strange music. "I got within 50 yards of that building," she swore, "and I could feel something pushing me back. Not physically, but something inside my head telling me to turn around and leave. Those boys are changed, Doctor. Changed in ways that ain't natural." The continuing mystery. As August gave way to September, the typhoid epidemic in Cedar Ridge began to subside. The well had been sealed, and surviving residents slowly resumed their routines. But the mystery of the Blackwood brothers only deepened. Dr. Morrison continued his weekly visits, ostensibly to monitor their condition, but really to document the progression of their change. What he observed shattered his medical understanding and made him question his own sanity. Ezra's internal temperature stabilized at 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, yet he showed no sign of organ failure or brain damage. His eyes had become permanently golden-hued, shifting and swirling like liquid metal. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that compelled listeners to agree with him, even when his statements defied logic. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra stated during one exam, "you are trying to measure us with instruments designed for ordinary human physiology. We have gone beyond the limitations those tools were created to assess. Our bodies now operate according to principles that your medical science has yet to discover." Caleb's rose-colored spots continued to evolve, forming increasingly intricate patterns that looked like ancient script. Morrison consulted scholars by mail, sending meticulous drawings of the markings, but none could identify the symbols. Even more disturbing, the patterns seemed to slowly migrate across Caleb's skin, rearranging themselves into new configurations every few days. When Morrison attempted to take a blood sample from Caleb's arm, he discovered the brothers' blood had transformed into something barely resembling normal human circulation. The substance that oozed from the puncture was thicker than blood, golden in color, and seemed to move with a deliberate, purposeful flow.